There is a name that the 20th century has not been able to fully bury, a name that provokes discomfort, fascination, and terror in the very breath. The historian Ian Kershaw devoted 30 years of his life to studying this man, producing the most comprehensive biography ever written about him. 2 volumes, more than 2,000 pages, based on a number of primary sources that no previous biographer had ever assembled. And yet, Kershaw admitted that there are things that simply cannot be known. There are holes in the historical record that are not accidental. Some documents disappeared, others were deliberately destroyed, and there are aspects of Hitler's mind and body that medicine, psychiatry, and modern genetics have surrounded without fully penetrating. On June 7, 1837, on a small farm in the village of Strones, in the Waldviertel region northwest of Vienna, a 42-year-old unmarried woman named Maria Anna Schicklgruber gave birth to an illegitimate child. The space for the father's name on the baptismal certificate was left blank. The priest wrote only one word: illegitimate. That boy was named Alois Schicklgruber. He was the father of Adolf Hitler, and the identity of his biological father has never been established with certainty. For decades, that empty box in Döllersheim's parish register was one of the Third Reich's most awkward secrets. Hitler never knew for sure who his biological grandfather was. Neither did his father. And historians who have tracked the matter for 80 years have not reached a definitive conclusion either, although they have ruled out several candidates with sufficient evidence. There are 3 main candidates that historiography has examined. The first is Johann Georg Hiedler, a wandering farmer from the Waldviertel region who married Maria Anna Schicklgruber in 1842, 5 years after Alois' birth, without ever having recognized the child in life. He died in 1857 without having signed any paternity documents. The second candidate is Johann Nepomuk Hitler, Georg's younger brother, and thus Maria Anna's brother-in-law, who in the following years took Alois under his wing and left him a significant part of his savings in inheritance. The third is a man named Leopold Frankenberger, supposedly Jewish, resident in Graz, whose existence as a candidate was proposed by Hans Frank himself, the Nazi Governor-General of Poland, during the Nuremberg trials in 1945. This third hypothesis was the one that had the most public impact for decades, but modern historians have systematically dismantled it. The Jews had been expelled from Styria, the region where Graz is located, in the 15th century, and were not allowed to return until the 1860s, several decades after Alois' birth in 1837. The documentary search for a Frankenberger in the Graz files for the corresponding period have not produced any results. Historian Ian Kershaw's conclusion is straightforward. Frankenberger's story is a fabrication, probably constructed by Frank for his own political gain at the time he was trying to negotiate his situation at Nuremberg. But the question about Alois's real biological father remains open. What did happen, and this is documented, is that in 1876, when Alois was already 39 years old and an established customs official, he appeared before a parish priest in Döllersheim with 3 witnesses and declared under oath that his father had been the late Johann Georg Hiedler. All 3 witnesses signed an affidavit. The priest, in an irregular way from the canonical point of view, modified the birth certificate of a man who had been with another surname for almost 40 years, and in that way Alois Schicklgruber legally became Alois Hitler. The legal and historical problem is obvious. Johann Georg Hiedler had been dead for 20 years and had never signed any acknowledgement of paternity in his lifetime. Why did Johann Nepomuk Hitler push for such a change precisely in 1876? Historian Werner Masse found documentation that in the same year the administrator of Alois's mother's estate transferred 230 florins to him. Some researchers suggest that the maneuver was a combination of pending inheritance and family need. Others propose that Alois's real biological father was Nepomuk himself, who had cared for the child for years while Georg wandered, and that the 1876 declaration was a way to legalize the surname without revealing the full truth. The very spelling of the surname is a minor but symptomatic mystery. The surname Alois, legally adopted, was Hitler, not Hiedler, which was the surname of the stated stepfather. No one knows who made that decision or why. Official government documents in Mistelbach in 1877 formalized the change with that spelling. Other variants existing in the region included Hitler, Hitler, and Hitler. The final name was, to some extent, random. What this means in historical terms is that Adolf Hitler spent his life aware that his grandfather's identity was a mystery. When Hans Frank investigated the matter on the orders of Hitler himself, who in 1930 had received a letter from a relative hinting at possible Jewish ancestry and feared being blackmailed, the Nazi lawyer was unable to close the case. The clause that Hitler inserted into the Nuremberg laws of 1935, prohibiting Jews from hiring German servants under the age of 45, has been interpreted by several historians as an attempt to ensure that the family scandal of Maria Anna Schicklgruber, who conceived Alois while working as a maid and was 41 years old, could not be repeated with other Jews. The 2025 DNA analysis, carried out by geneticist Turi King, for the documentary Hitler's DNA, Blueprint of a Dictator, broadcast by Channel 4, identified a mutation in the PROK2 gene associated with Kallmann syndrome in traces of blood attributed to Hitler. But on the identity of the grandfather, the DNA could not pronounce. There is no genetic material of the candidates to compare with. The box of the minutes of Alois Schicklgruber's baptism, metaphorically speaking, is still blank 80 years after the end of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler himself tried to explain it. In Mein Kampf, published in 2 parts in 1925 and 1926, the first dictated to Rudolf Hess while he was serving time in Landsberg prison for the failed beer hall putsch of November 1923, he described his conversion to anti-Semitism as the result of a slow and painful revelation during his years in Vienna between 1908 and 1913. He claimed that he arrived in that city without significant prejudices and that it was the contact with the reality of the imperial capital that opened his eyes to the Jewish threat. But most historians, including Ian Kershaw, have concluded that this narrative was constructed retrospectively for clear political purposes. What makes the mystery genuinely disturbing is evidence contrary to the official narrative. While Hitler was supposedly developing his hatred of Jews in Vienna, one of his most loyal and consistent customers was a Jewish merchant named Samuel Morgenstern, who bought his watercolors from Viennese buildings and resold them to lawyers and businessmen, most of whom were also Jewish. And the doctor who treated her mother Clara Pölzl during her death throes from breast cancer in 1907, Dr. Eduard Bloch, was Jewish. Bloch administered iodoform, an antiseptic with a painful application and a pungent odor, the only one available in that advanced stage of the disease, for weeks. Hitler professed gratitude to him for life. When the Nazis occupied Austria in March 1938, the Führer personally ensured that Bloch and his wife were exempted from anti-Semitic laws and could emigrate without reprisals, a benefit that in 1940 allowed them to reach the United States. That contrasts violently with the picture that Hitler himself constructed of his Viennese years. His childhood friend August Kubizek, who shared a room with him for a time in Vienna and left his memoirs decades later, wrote that even then Hitler's hatred of the Jews was virulent and fully formed. But Kubizek also describes how Hitler frequented cafes and cultural circles where half of those present were Jewish, with no apparent tension. The Encyclopedia of the Washington Holocaust Museum concludes that the material evidence of Hitler's life in Vienna does not confirm an active anti-Semitism during those years. Evidence that he adopted a comprehensive anti-Semitic ideology points to a post-1918 period. The most widely accepted hypothesis today places the definitive hardening not in Vienna, but at the time of the German defeat. On November 9, 1918, while Hitler was recovering in the military hospital of Pasewalk, blinded by mustard gas, he heard the news of the Kaiser's abdication and surrender. In his own words in Mein Kampf, his eyes darkened again. He then fanatically embraced the Dolchstoßlegende, the legend of the stab in the back. Germany had not lost on the battlefield, but had been betrayed from within by Jews and Marxists. That narrative, which had no factual basis, but had enormous emotional potency for the millions of Germans who could not process the defeat, was the ideological scaffolding on which Hitler built his entire subsequent political career. Two Austrian politicians had a documented influence on his thinking. The first was Georg Ritter von Schönerer, a German nationalist who argued that the German-speaking regions of Austria-Hungary should join the German Empire and that Jews could not be full German citizens. The second was Karl Lueger, mayor of Vienna between 1897 and his death in 1910, who practiced a populist and pragmatic anti-Semitism. He even said, "Who is a Jew is for me to decide," capable of mobilizing the Viennese middle and lower classes with anti-Jewish rhetoric while maintaining personal relations with Jews when it suited him. Hitler, in Mein Kampf, called Lueger the greatest German mayor of all time, and made his style the model for his own later political career. But the real trigger for anti-Semitism as a total political project, the moment when it went from being a diffuse set of prejudices to becoming the axis of its entire worldview, remains, from the point of view of historiography, impossible to date precisely. The Anne Frank House in Amsterdam formulates it directly in its public documentation. The origin of Hitler's hatred against the Jews is unknown. That phrase, produced by the most dedicated institution in the world to the study of the Holocaust, is in itself a historical mystery of the first magnitude. Hitler's medical file from his hospitalization at Pasewalk between October and November 1918, which might reveal what went on in his mind during those crucial weeks, was declared lost in the late 1920s and has never reappeared. His specific disappearance, in the period when Hitler was rising to power and had reason not to want anyone to know how he was treated psychiatrically, is a circumstance that historians point out without being able to prove anything. On October 14, 1918, Corporal Adolf Hitler, messenger of the 16th Bavarian Infantry Regiment, was hit along with several comrades by a cloud of mustard gas in the Vervik area of Belgium during a defensive battle on the Flanders front. Blind, he crawled back to the German camp with his companions, also without vision. The other affected soldiers were sent to nearby military hospitals for conventional eye treatment. Hitler was transferred almost 800 kilometers to the military reserve hospital in Pasewalk in Pomeranian, because the doctors who initially examined him concluded that his blindness was partially or totally psychosomatic. The diagnosis was psychopathic hysteria. In the medical parlance of the time, that meant that Hitler was suffering from what we would today call a conversion disorder. Actual physical symptoms, functional blindness in this case, produced by a psychological mechanism with no identifiable organic damage to the eyes. The research journal European Archives of Psychiatry and Clinical Neuroscience has published fragments of the clinical history of the corresponding patient, which confirm this diagnosis and place the hospitalization on October 14, 1918. In Pasewalk, Hitler was treated by the neuropsychiatrist Edmund Forster, who specialized precisely in the so-called hysterical war disorders. Forster was known for his theory that soldiers with war hysteria were actually cowards who faked or amplified symptoms to escape the front and treated them with what he called tough love, direct confrontation, suggestion techniques, and in some cases hypnosis. On November 9, 1918, while Hitler was in bed at Pasewalk, news of the Kaiser's abdication and armistice reached the hospital. According to his account in Mein Kampf, when he heard the news his eyes darkened again, he suffered a relapse. But on November 19, 1918, 36 days after his admission, he was discharged completely cured. The question historians have been asking for decades is, what exactly did Forster do with Hitler during those weeks to produce both the first and second healings? The psychohistorian Rudolf Binion published in the journal History of Childhood Quarterly a hypothesis that has had wide resonance. Forster, using suggestive hypnosis techniques, may have deliberately induced in Hitler a messianic mission, the idea that he had a special destiny, that Germany needed it, that he was a providential figure, as a therapeutic mechanism to restore his vision. In his own words, Forster's method was to create in the patient a mission greater than his symptoms. For a man like Hitler, a failed artist, no family, no job, no prospects, that mission might have been clinically effective and politically catastrophic. Medical writer Ernst Weiss received confidential information about the case directly from Forster in Paris in 1933, shortly after Hitler came to power, and used it as the basis for a novel entitled Der Augenzeuge, The Eyewitness, published posthumously in 1963. The novel fictionally reconstructs the treatment of an Austrian corporal in Pasewalk with hypnotic techniques that induce messianic beliefs. Edmund Forster died in September 1933, 8 months after Hitler took over the chancellorship, in circumstances that several sources describe as suicide but which were not investigated. Ernst Weiss also committed suicide in 1940 in Paris, when German troops occupied the city. The Gestapo murdered several other people who had had access to Hitler's medical file at Pasewalk. The research published in Revista Pesquisa FAPESP by Brazilian academics adds another angle. Hitler's colleagues who suffered the same gas attack in Vervik were treated in conventional hospitals and recovered their sight within days. Only Hitler was sent to Pasewalk, and only Hitler suffered the mysterious relapse upon receiving the news of the armistice. What this suggests, without being able to be proven, is that Hitler's blindness had a dominant psychological component from the beginning, and that Forster's treatment, whatever it was exactly, produced effects that go far beyond the clinical case. Whether the blindness was completely psychosomatic, partially organic, whether the cure included hypnosis with messianic content, or whether it was all a combination of natural recovery and casual suggestion, is something that medical science cannot determine because Pasewalk's record does not exist. And therein lies the real mystery, not in what happened, but in the fact that someone made sure we could never know. In the autumn of 1907, an 18-year-old young man with his hands dirty with watercolor took the entrance exam at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, convinced, in his own words years later, that his entry was a formality. The young man was Adolf Hitler, and the admissions committee determined that his drawings had insufficiency in the representation of heads, and that the test as a whole was mediocre. It was rejected. He returned in the autumn of 1908 with a more elaborate technique. He was rejected again, this time with a note in the evaluation report that said insufficient drawing sample and warned that the drawings of heads are scarce and the rest of the test was mediocre. He was forbidden to appear again. The director of the center suggested that he try a career in architecture because his depictions of buildings showed a certain technical precision. But without the required academic record, Hitler had dropped out of school at the age of 16, passing only the drawing subject. That door was also closed. In the following 5 years, between 1908 and 1913, Hitler wandered through Vienna in a situation of increasing semi-destitution. He slept in homeless men's shelters in the Meidling neighborhood. He ate in soup kitchens. He sold watercolors of Viennese buildings to framers and tourists, sometimes through Reinhold Hanisch, a man who briefly became his informal agent and with whom he later had a legal dispute. He produced more than 1,000 works in that period, according to the most accepted calculations. Most depicted buildings and landscapes with a notable absence of human figures. The Academy had pointed out exactly that. Drawings of heads are scarce. Hitler was incapable of representing people with conviction. The main buyer of his watercolors was Samuel Morgenstern, a Jewish merchant who paid him fair prices and connected him with a network of clients. Most of those clients were also Jews, lawyers, doctors, merchants from central Vienna who decorated their studios with scenes of the city. While building a narrative of Jewish oppression in his head, the young Hitler subsisted economically thanks to Jewish buyers. This biographical paradox, which appears in the Academy's own archives, in Morgenstern's records and in Hanisch's memoirs, has not been satisfactorily explained by any psychological analysis. Hitler's paintings have been sold at international auctions since the 1990s for tens of thousands of euros each. In April 2009, a series of watercolours was auctioned by auction team Breker in Cologne for prices ranging from €10,000 to €45,000 per work. Other pieces are in the possession of the US government, confiscated after the war. The artistic evaluation of his work has been consistently the same: technical correctness in the architectural representation, total absence of interior life, cold and impersonal. A German art critic summarized that in Hitler's paintings, the buildings are perfect but the streets are empty. No one lives in the world he painted. Behind one of his paintings, discovered during archival research, appeared several drawings signed with the initials AH that represented Walt Disney characters, several dwarfs and Pinocchio. That finding, made public in the early 2000s, continues to be a source of analysis of his psychology. The man who would try to destroy European civilization scribbled characters from fairy tales on the back of his paintings. But the central mystery is not artistic, but historical counterfactual. How much of what happened afterwards has a direct relationship with that rejection? The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts had several professors of Jewish origin in its admission tribunal in 1907 and 1908. Hitler believed and repeatedly claimed that it was they who rejected him for reasons of origin rather than talent. That conviction, although historically unprovable, was part of the emotional scaffolding of his later anti-Semitism. When he came to power in 1933, he ordered the SS to assassinate several members of the tribunal that had rejected him decades earlier, according to accounts collected in survivors' testimonies and in the work of historian John Toland. Those executions were never officially documented. The question that no one can answer is whether the history of the first half of the century, the 20th century, would have been different if a committee of Viennese teachers had seen something different in those watercolors of buildings. There is something disturbing in thinking that the fate of tens of millions of people may have depended, in part, on the opinion of a group of evaluators on the stroke of a young Austrian. By April 1945, Adolf Hitler was taking 28 pills a day, in addition to injections. Dr. Theodor Morell, born in 1886 in Treis-Münzenberg, Hesse, was a general practitioner in Berlin's high society when he was introduced to Hitler in 1936 through the official party photographer Heinrich Hoffmann. The Führer was then suffering from severe skin eczema and chronic gastrointestinal problems. Morell prescribed Mutaflor, a preparation of intestinal bacteria that relieved symptoms in weeks. Hitler's loyalty to this doctor from that moment until April 22, 1945, was absolute and unwavering, even when the generals of his staff insinuated, never clearly enough, that the doctor might be slowly poisoning him. The medical diary Morell kept of the substances administered to Hitler was captured by Allied forces and has been studied by pharmacologists and historians for decades. The list is clinically extraordinary. Cocaine eye drops, officially prescribed to treat eye irritation, administered with a regularity that no ophthalmologist would consider acceptable. Pervitin, the methamphetamine that the Wehrmacht supplied to its soldiers under the trade name tank chocolates to keep them alert during prolonged operations. Eucadal, a high-potency synthetic opiate, the oxycodone of the time, chemically similar to heroin. Bull semen extract, supposedly administered as a hormonal stimulant. Strychnine in small doses presented as a tonic, vitamins in large quantities, intravenous glucose, testosterone, estradiol, corticosteroids, barbiturates, and dozens of preparations owned by Morell, many of whose exact ingredients were never identified because the doctor refused to reveal them. The journalist and writer Norman Ohler, in his book The Great Delirium, Hitler, Drugs and the Third Reich, 2016, argues that Hitler's dependence on these substances, especially Eucadal and Pervitin, was decisive in their behavior during the last years of the war. He argues that the most irrational decisions of the 1943 to 1945 period, the refusal to allow the Sixth Army to withdraw from Stalingrad, the rejection of armistice plans, The conviction that non-existent armies could save Berlin occurred during periods of high medication or in phases of withdrawal when Allied bombing raids on German pharmaceutical factories cut off supplies. Psychiatrist Leonard L. Heston of the University of Minnesota, in his book The Medical Casebook of Adolf Hitler, 1980, was more careful. He documented that Hitler used amphetamines in quantities that can produce paranoia and delusions, but he pointed out that the causal relationship between medication and political decisions cannot be established clinically retroactively. What is documented and has no satisfactory explanation is the source of certain medications. After the attack of July 20th, 1944, when the Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed an explosive briefcase under the conference table of the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, East Prussia, wounding Hitler in both arms, nose and eardrums, Morell treated the Führer with topical penicillin. The antibiotic, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928 and mass-produced by the Allies since 1943, had barely been introduced experimentally to the front by the US military. Germany did not manufacture it in quantity for application clinical. When agents of US intelligence interrogated Morell after the war about where he had obtained penicillin, the doctor claimed not to know the drug at all. His interlocutors showed him the records of his own diary. He couldn't explain it. The journalist Eric Frattini, in his book Patient A, 2025, based on a detailed analysis of Morell's diaries, states that Hitler's medical history was that of a severe hypochondriac undergoing treatment that progressively turned him into an addict functional. He took pills in industrial quantities, Frattini writes, and the correlation between periods of increased medication and more disastrous strategic decisions is statistically suggestive, though impossible to prove, as causation. Several members of Hitler's inner circle, questioned after the war for historian James O'Donnell's book The Bunker, claimed that Morell held a significant amount of stock in a pharmaceutical company that marketed a product fraudulently presented as penicillin or sulfur. If that is true, the doctor not only administered substances of unforeseeable effects to Hitler without his complete knowledge, but also benefited financially from the process. The fate of that pharmaceutical company's assets after the war was never exhaustively traced. There's one image that Berlin bunker survivors remembered for decades, many of them with extraordinary visual accuracy. Hitler's left hand, trembling with the slow, rhythmic trembling characteristic of Parkinson's at rest, which he hid under the table during staff conferences. Sometimes he would put his right hand on it to fix it. Other times he sat with his left arm close to his body, immobile due to muscle rigidity, not discipline. Bernd Freytag von Loringhoven, who attended dozens of such conferences between July 1944 and the end of April 1945 as aide-de-camp to General Heinz Guderian, described in his memoirs In the Bunker with Hitler, a man who at 55 looked 30 years older, who walked hunched over, who shuffled his left foot, and whose voice had lost the power that had hypnotized millions of Germans. Ellen Gibbles, a neurologist at the University of Cologne, published in the late 1980s a comprehensive analysis of available video recordings of Hitler, comparing the progression of their motor symptoms with the clinical patterns of Parkinson's disease. His conclusion, supported by a broad spectrum of the international neurological community, was that Hitler was suffering from Parkinson's disease with high probability. The documented symptoms, unilateral resting tremor in the left hand, bradykinesia, muscle stiffness, characteristic gait, fit the clinical picture of the disease with a coherence that most specialists have found compelling. The neurologist Raghav Gupta, in an article published in the journal World Neurosurgery, went further. If Hitler's first motor symptoms are visible, as several testimonies suggest, as early as 1933, then Hitler ruled most of the Third Reich with a degenerative disease of the central nervous system that progressively deteriorated not only his motor function but also his cognitive abilities. Parkinson's, in its advanced stages, is associated with impulsivity, mental rigidity, inability to modify decisions already made, and in some cases with hallucinations. Research published in Dialnet on Hitler's Parkinson's disease and its influence on World War II carried out by a Spanish doctor and historian, suggests that the symptoms visible as early as 1937 to 1938 may have led Hitler to bring forward his military expansion schedule for fear that his physical deterioration would advance before he could complete his objectives. But therein lies the central methodological complication. The pharmacological cocktail that Morel administered to him for years could have produced motor symptoms similar to those of Parkinson's by completely different mechanisms. The Pervitin, methamphetamine, produces long-term dopaminergic impairment in the basal ganglia, the same brain circuits affected in Parkinson's. The Eucadol, opiate, can cause muscle stiffness and bradykinesia. Barbiturates impair motor control. And the abrupt withdrawal of any of these substances in the periods when the Allied bombing raids of 1944 interrupted the pharmaceutical supply produces withdrawal symptoms with characteristic tremors and rigidity. The specialist doctor who participated in the neuro-friendly blog points out a specific fact. Hitler's tremor was unilateral, only his left hand, which is characteristic of Parkinson's but not of withdrawal syndrome, which would affect both limbs equally. This anatomical detail is the strongest argument in favor of the diagnosis of Parkinson's as a primary condition, although it does not exclude that Morel's medication exacerbated it. The 2025 DNA analysis also identified the mutation in the PROK2 gene associated with Kalman syndrome. That mutation can cause not only the aforementioned cryptorchidism, but also developmental dopaminergic deficits, which would make the individual potentially more susceptible to Parkinson's in adulthood. Turi King, the geneticist responsible for the analysis, was careful to point out the limits of that inference. Genetics identifies vulnerabilities, not fates. The question that no retroactive diagnosis can answer with certainty is how much of the catastrophe of the last 3 years of the war was the product of the Hitler's neurological disease, how much was the effect of Morel's drugs, and how much was the result of a mind that had always worked that way and simply could no longer disguise it. On April 30th, 1945, at approximately 3:30 p.m., according to the most consistent testimonies, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his private room in the Führerbunker. His aide Otto Günscher and personal assistant Heinz Linger removed the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun to the Chancellery Garden following instructions that Hitler himself had given hours earlier. They bathed them in gasoline. It is estimated that between 180 and 200 liters, and burned them. The garden, constantly bombarded by Soviet artillery, was covered in craters. The smoke was one more among the many that covered Berlin that afternoon. So far, there is a solid consensus among historians based on multiple converging testimonies of people who were present. The problem begins with what the Soviets found and what they did with it in the days and weeks that followed. The first units of the Smersh, the counterintelligence service of the Red Army, arrived at the Chancellery Garden on May 5, 1945, and began excavating the craters in the garden. They recovered charred remains of several bodies. On May 11, 1945, Soviet forensic dentists compared part of a lower jaw with the records of dentist Hugo Blaschke and the testimonies of his assistant, Kerta Heusermann, who identified the dental work, several specific crowns and bridges, as that of Adolf Hitler. Fritze Echtmann, a dental technician who had made some of the prostheses, corroborated the identification. The Soviets had the dental certainty of Hitler's death as early as May 1945, but Stalin did not want that to be known. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, when Churchill and Truman asked him directly if he had any news about Hitler's whereabouts, the Soviet leader replied that he believed Hitler lived in Spain or Argentina. It was deliberate disinformation. Marshal Georgy Zhukov had publicly declared on June 9, 1945, on Stalin's orders, that Hitler's fate was unknown. 68% of Americans surveyed that month believed Hitler was still alive. In October 1945, the newspaper France Soir quoted the Nazi ambassador to Vichy France, Otto Abetz, as saying that Hitler was not dead. The disinformation apparatus worked exactly as Stalin had planned. The identified remains were secretly transferred. First to a wooded area in Magdeburg in the Soviet occupation zone, where they were buried in an unmarked barracks yard. There they remained until 1970, when KGB chairman Yuri Andropov ordered them to be exhumed, burned in an incinerator, and the ashes scattered in the Biederitz River, a tributary of the Elbe. The order was executed on the 4th of 1970. The stated reason: to prevent the burial site from becoming a neo-Nazi pilgrimage site. On May 30th, 1946, MVD agents had found a skull fragment in the crater of the garden where Hitler had initially been buried, the left parietal bone, with a hole consistent with a projectile exit wound. That piece was stored in Soviet archives, miscatalogued for decades, rediscovered in the Russian state archives in 1993 and subjected to forensic analysis in 2008 by archaeologist Nick Bellantoni of the state of Connecticut. Their report was published in the Journal of Forensic Science in 2009 and produced one of the most disturbing revelations of the case. The bone was too thin to correspond to an adult male. The cranial sutures suggested someone under 40, and DNA analysis performed on a small fragment confirmed that the skull was from a woman. The media impact was enormous and fueled every conspiracy theory imaginable. But the most likely interpretation, according to historian Julio B. Muti in Hitler's Last Lair, 2025, and subsequent historical analyses, is more prosaic. That skull fragment belonged to someone else, probably Eva Braun, or one of the other dead in the Chancellery Garden. The Soviet chain of custody was so chaotic, different departments of the Soviet security apparatus competing with each other, contradictory orders, mixed materials, that confusion of remains was virtually inevitable. In 2018, Professor Philippe Charlier of the Raymond Poincaré Hospital in Garches, France, gained access to the lower jaw preserved in Russian archives and subjected it to full forensic analysis, including electron microscopy and elemental analysis. His report, published in the European Journal of Internal Medicine, was categorical. The dental morphology, specific prostheses, registered dental treatments and chemical composition coincided with all of Hitler's previous dental documentation. Between the teeth he found bluish glass particles consistent with cyanide capsule fragments. Charlier stated unambiguously, "Teeth are authentic, there's no doubt about it. Our study proves that Hitler died in 1945. But the broken chain of custody between 1945 and 2018, with decades of deliberate Soviet disinformation, several transfers of remains, an incineration in 1970 and a skull fragment that turned out to be that of a woman, has left a space of ambiguity that no subsequent analysis has been able to completely close for the general public. And that, in itself, is part of the mystery. Eyewitnesses in the bunker, including SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Günscher, Sturmbannführer Heinz Linger, Secretary Traudl Junge, and the last radio operator SS Hauptsturmführer Rochus Misch, testified that it is converging that Hitler shot himself in the right temple while biting into a cyanide capsule, but the details diverge on points that are not minor. Günscher, who was waiting outside the room and entered upon hearing the shot, described Hitler leaning forward on the table with a hole in his right temple. Linger remembered that the body was in a slightly different posture. Secretary Junge was not present at the time of the suicide. And Misch, in interviews given until a few years before his death in September 2013, consistently stated that he never heard any shots, that he only knew of death by the movements of people in the hallway. The pistol used was a 7.65mm caliber Walther PPK. That weapon, which would have been the central ballistics evidence of any forensic investigation, was never recovered. Several objects from the bunker disappeared in the chaos of the final days and in the Soviet occupation. On the sofa in Hitler's room, SMERSH agents found a bloodstain that was analyzed. In 2025, that analysis was part of Turi King's DNA project for Channel 4, which confirmed the presence of male genetic material with the characteristics of the profile identified in the dental remains. Stalin, as already mentioned, preferred the exclusive cyanide version. In the official Soviet narrative of 1945, Hitler had died poisoned, like a coward. The testimonies that pointed to the shooting were ignored or contradicted. The Soviet forensic doctors who performed the autopsy in May 1945, according to Lev Bezimensky's book published in 1968 with official information from the Kremlin, found only traces of cyanide and concluded that both Hitler and Eva Braun had died of poisoning. That version did not agree with what a dozen eyewitnesses had testified. Charlier's analysis in 2018 attempted to resolve the issue. Between the teeth of the jaw fragment, he identified bluish glass particles consistent with the breakage of a bitten cyanide ampule. That confirmed that the capsule was used, but the data was also consistent with the combination of cyanide and simultaneous firing, which is the version that most historians, including Ian Kershaw, consider most likely. Hitler bit the capsule and at the same time pulled the trigger of the Walther PPK so as not to leave anything to chance. In that scenario, the direct cause of death would have been the bullet, with cyanide as an additional measure of certainty. But the bullet was never found. The remains of the skull, cremated in 1970 and scattered in the Biederitz, no longer exist. The pistol was never recovered. The Soviet autopsy file, classified for decades, contains internal contradictions that its own compilers acknowledged. The exact manner of Adolf Hitler's death 80 years later is still technically the subject of debate among forensic specialists. In 1943, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the predecessor of the CIA, commissioned psychoanalyst Walter C. Langer to develop a psychological profile of Adolf Hitler that could be useful in predicting his behavior and devising strategies against him. The resulting report, entitled A Psychological Analysis of Adolf Hitler, His Life and Legend, was completed with the collaboration of several specialist psychologists, including Henry Murray of Harvard, and classified until 1968 when it was published as a book under the title The Mind of Adolf Hitler. The conclusions of Langer's report included hypotheses that have aged poorly, that Hitler was probably homosexual, possibly impotent, and coprophilic. These claims, formulated without direct evidence and based on second-hand testimonies frequently biased by the political mood of the time, were criticized by most later historians. Ron Rosenbaum, in his book Explaining Hitler, 1998, called them psychoanalytic speculation without empirical support. But the problem is not the specific conclusions of Langer's report. The problem is that in 80 years of historical, medical and psychological research, no one has been able to offer a psychiatric diagnosis of Adolf Hitler that is simultaneously compatible with all the available evidence accepted by the academic consensus. The catalogue of diagnoses proposed over the decades is extraordinary in its length and in its internal contradictions. Paranoid personality, malignant narcissism, schizoid personality disorder, schizophrenia with paranoia and megalomania, hysterical psychopathy, borderline personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of combat in World War I, and advanced neurological syphilis since 1942 have been proposed. Historian Deborah Hayden, in her book Pox, Genius, Madness, and the Mysteries of Syphilis, 2003, proposed that Hitler contracted syphilis sometime in his youth and that the disease had progressed to neurosyphilis by 1942, producing the paranoid tantrums and progressive inability to assess tactical reality that characterized his last years in office. That hypothesis would also explain some of the physical symptoms, weakness, gastrointestinal problems, certain behavioral patterns, that Parkinson's doesn't fully cover. But there is no direct serological evidence of syphilis in Hitler, and the hypothesis remains speculative. Ian Kershaw, in his monumental 2-volume biography published between 1998 and 2000, deliberately rejected the psychopathological approach. His argument is methodological and has had great influence. Explaining Hitler through individual psychiatry turns a collective historical phenomenon into a personal clinical problem, and that is a reduction that obscures more than it illuminates. The Holocaust was not possible because Hitler was crazy. It was possible because tens of thousands of psychiatrically functioning people executed their orders with bureaucratic efficiency. The pathology of Nazism was systemic, not individual. But there is one aspect of Hitler's psychology that no historical approach has been able to satisfactorily explain: his ability to function extraordinarily effectively in some domains while simultaneously catastrophic in others. The same man who in 1940 conceived the war plan against France that humiliated the army that had resisted 4 years in the Great War made the decision in December 1941 to declare war on the United States 4 days after Pearl Harbor without any obligation to do so and against all strategic logic. The same man who could retain by heart the technical details of dozens of tank and aircraft models genuinely believed, to the end, that armies that had ceased to exist could save Berlin. This coexistence of specific analytical capacity and global cognitive collapse in other domains is what psychiatrists call selective executive dysfunction. It can be caused by Parkinson's, multi-substance addiction, neurosyphilis, a pre-existing personality disorder, or several of those overlapping conditions. Modern psychiatry does not have a diagnosis that integrates that specific combination consistently, especially since the subject has been dead for 80 years and has never undergone direct clinical evaluation. Angela Maria Gelli-Raubal was born on June 4, 1908 in Linz, Hitler's hometown, the daughter of her half-sister Angela. She was 16 when she began living with her uncle. Hitler was 35. Around 1924, first in Munich and then in the apartment at 16 Prinzregentenplatz in the city centre, which Hitler rented in 1929 to accommodate his niece while she was supposedly studying medicine at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität. The relationship was consistently described by contemporaries as stormy, suffocating, and marked by Hitler's obsessive jealousy. After Gelli had an affair with Emil Maurice, Hitler's personal chauffeur, he fired Maurice immediately. She ordered that Gelli not leave the apartment unattended, that someone from the party should always accompany her to the movies, shopping, anywhere. When she expressed a desire to travel to Vienna to continue her singing lessons, Hitler forbade her to do so. Otto Strasser, an internal rival of the NSDAP's left wing and Hitler's personal enemy, published years later that Gelli had confided in him personally that Hitler asked him to do just disgusting things, a claim that historians have debated but that Kershaw, in his biography, called consistent with patterns of behavior that other sources also suggest. Whether actively sexual or not, the behavior Hitler's relationship with Gelli has all the traits of a strong or at least latent sexual dependence. On September 18, 1931, after a violent argument in which Hitler refused to allow him to travel to Vienna, he left for Nuremberg to attend a party meeting. The next day, September 19, 1931, Gelli was found dead in her apartment room. He had a gunshot wound to his lung. The pistol was his uncle's Walter. The letter he had begun writing the night before lay on the desk, incomplete. No one had heard the shot. The official version was suicide. Munich police, whose investigations came under the control of the fast-rising Nazi Party, closed the case within days. No public autopsy was performed. The original police reports presented irregularities that several subsequent investigators pointed out. The Munich press, which in the following days characterized the case as a mysterious affair, was silenced by pressures that novelist Fabiano Massimi documented in his research for The Angel of Munich, 2020. Hermann Göring said at the Nuremberg trials that with Gelli's death, Hitler lost the last drop of humanity he had left. Heinrich Hoffmann, a personal photographer and privileged witness, claimed that Gelli's room at the Berghof was kept as a sanctuary, with fresh flowers and portraits of her until the end of the regime. Eva Braun met Hitler through Hoffmann in 1929, when she was 17 years old and working as an assistant in the photographic studio. He began his official relationship with Hitler a few months after Gelli's suicide. In August 1932, Braun attempted suicide by shooting himself in the chest with his father's pistol. Survived. In May 1935, he made a second attempt with sleeping pills, which also failed. The relationship was kept secret for more than 12 years. The German public did not know of Eva Braun's existence until the end of the war. Hitler's sex life within that relationship is, as historian Heike Gertemacher pointed out in Eva Braun, A Life with Hitler, 2010, essentially unknown. In 1943, Eva went to see the architect Albert Speer, visibly disturbed, and told him that Hitler had confessed to her that he was no longer capable of performing as a man and had suggested that he look for another. Speer recounted it in his memoirs, published in 1969. Dr. Morell, for his part, told Allied investigators that Hitler's sex life had been normal, but Morell was the last man to say anything different about his patient. The 1943 OSS report claimed that Hitler was impotent and coprophilic. Historian Lothar Machtan, in The Hidden Hitler, 2001, argued with circumstantial documentation that Hitler had homosexual relations during part of his life, especially in the Vienna period and during the early years of the party. This hypothesis was rejected by most specialists as insufficiently supported. What is clear is that Hitler's sexuality was atypical in ways that no analysis has been able to define precisely. From the documented relationships, Geli Raubal, Eva Braun, some earlier infatuations in Munich, emerges the pattern of a man incapable of intimacy, egalitarian, who sought relationships of domination, and who was romantically involved with women who depended on him totally. In December 2015, German historian Peter Fleischmann announced that he had found in the Bavarian State Archives a medical document from 1923 corresponding to an examination carried out on Hitler after the failed Munich beer hall putsch. The document, whose authenticity was verified by Bavarian archivists, mentions right-sided cryptorchidism. Hitler's right testicle had not completed its natural descent into the scrotum during fetal development. That same year, historians Jonathan Mayo and Emma Craigie published in Hitler's Last Day, Minute by Minute, that Hitler also suffered from penile hypospadias, a congenital anomaly in which the urethra opens at the lower part of the shaft of the penis instead of the distal end. People with severe hypospadias should urinate sitting down. The condition, according to Mayo and Craigie, was documented in medical records they consulted for investigation, though they did not specify which ones. Emma Craigie was forced to give a public clarification to the Independent newspaper after the headlines emphasized the most sensationalist angle. She pointed out that the documents confirmed the abnormal position of the urethra, not the specific size of the penis. The 2025 DNA analysis, carried out by Turi King for the Channel 4 documentary, identified a mutation in the PROK2 gene, which is associated with Kallmann syndrome, in the genetic material analyzed. This condition, of genetic origin, produces hypogonadotropic hypogonadism in its complete form, reduced function of the gonads, and can cause precisely the non-descent of a testicle. King said, "We can't say with absolute certainty that Hitler was monarchid, but the mutation is there, and it agrees with the rumor that has circulated for decades." The rumor King was referring to has a cultural history of its own. During World War II, British troops sang a march called "Hitler Has Only Got One Ball," the origin of which no one has been able to trace exactly, although popular versions attributed the information to a Red Cross doctor who would have treated Hitler in World War I. The connection between those physical conditions and Hitler's behavioral patterns, the compulsive search for dominance, the inability for egalitarian intimacy, violence as an expression of power, aggressive compensation, belongs to the field of speculative psychology and has been exploited by authors of different tendencies. The most rigorous historians are cautious. The relationship between physical conditions and political behavior is complex in anyone, and in Hitler's case, it is mediated by decades of mythology and propaganda. But there is a dimension to the matter that is historical, not speculative. If Hitler knew of these conditions, and he likely did, given that he was medically examined multiple times throughout his life, that awareness may have influenced certain documented behaviors. The systematic concealment of Eva Braun, the refusal to marry for more than a decade, the relationship with Geli Raubal instead of with a woman of his age, the obsessive control over the people closest to him. None of this can be proven causally, but the coincidence of factors is striking enough for researchers to keep asking the question. Beginning in about 1937, with documented exceptions, Adolf Hitler eliminated meat from his diet and adopted abstinence from alcohol and tobacco as declared habits. Nazi propaganda built on this image, a story of purity and asceticism that the magazine New Thought summarized in a 1938 article. Do you know that your Führer is a vegetarian and that he does not eat meat because of his general attitude towards life and his love for the animal world? The public image was that of a man who had risen above ordinary material needs. The reality was more complex and more human and is documented by multiple sources. Cook Dion Lucas, who served Hitler on several occasions before the war, claimed in her memoirs that her favorite dish was stuffed pigeon. Cookbooks at the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine residence near Berchtesgaden, record orders for Leberknödel, the beef liver dumplings of Bavarian cuisine. Heinrich Hoffmann, his personal photographer and friend of decades, described Hitler eating these croquettes whenever he prepared them for him. And several testimonies from the inner circle report that on sleepless nights, which were frequent, Hitler would go through the pantry of the bunker or the chancellery looking for sweets, apple pie with walnuts and raisins, or sweets that he discreetly accumulated. Hitler's vegetarianism, therefore, was inconsistent with the facts. Historian Ian Kershaw, in his biography, called it bizarre and casual. But the real mystery is not dietary inconsistency, but the medical cause of late vegetarianism. The historian and physician Henrik Eberle, together with Professor Joachim Neumann in his book War Hitler Krank, Was Hitler Ill?, documented that Hitler suffered from severe and recurrent intestinal disorders that progressively worsened from 1936. Extreme flatulence, severe abdominal cramps, episodes of alternating diarrhea and constipation that sometimes incapacitated him for hours. Morell treated these disorders with a combination of intestinal extracts, preparations of bacteria, atropine, an anticholinergic compound that in excessive doses is toxic, and several proprietary remedies whose ingredients were never fully identified. Why did Hitler develop such severe digestive disorders? Documented hypotheses include extreme chronic stress, the damage accumulated by Morell's medication over the years. Several of the compounds administered have known gastrointestinal adverse effects, the possible progression of Parkinson's disease, which affects the autonomic nervous system including gut motility, and the neurosyphilis that Deborah Hayden proposed. German biographer Joachim Fest noted that Hitler described his own body with increasing disgust over the past few years, as if he felt he betrayed it. There is one fact that the dietary analysis of the books of the Berghof and the Führer Bunker reveals in an indirect way. In the last months of Hitler's life, his diet was reduced to vegetable broth, small portions of spaghetti, and occasionally tea. A man who in 1939 could eat a full dinner of several hours with his guests in the Chancellery, in 1945 barely ate enough to stay on his feet. That physical progression, combined with Morell's medication and possible Parkinson's disease, paints a portrait of an organism in accelerated collapse that no doctor of the time could or wanted him to address with diagnostic honesty. On the morning of September 19, 1931, when employees of the apartment at 16 Prinzregentenplatz in Munich forced open the door to Geli Raubal's room because no one had answered the calls, they found the 23-year-old lying on the floor. He had a gunshot wound to his lung. His uncle Adolf Hitler's Walter G. .35 pistol was at his side. On the desk, an interrupted letter addressed to a friend in Vienna, which was never finished. No one in the apartment had heard the shot. The Munich police were summoned. The case was ruled a suicide. A complete autopsy was not carried out with the guarantees of an independent investigation. The police reports that existed were partially altered or suppressed, according to subsequent research collected by the novelist Fabiano Massimi in his exhaustive documentation for The Angel of Munich, 2020. The Nazi Party, which in 1931 was on the rise and needed to protect its leader from any scandal that might compromise him, mobilized its influence over the Bavarian press and police to close the matter quickly. There are data that historians have identified as anomalous. The first, Hitler was on his way to Nuremberg when Geli died. He was intercepted and returned to Munich. In the hours before his departure, they had had a violent argument about Geli's trip to Vienna. The second, the interrupted letter on the desk. A person who plans to commit suicide usually doesn't leave a half-hearted letter to a friend about an everyday matter. The third, the position of the shot, in the lung, not in the head, is unusual for suicide. The fourth, Geli's nose showed, according to some unverified accounts, signs of having received a blow. That information, if accurate, would imply physical violence before the shooting. But there is no original autopsy to confirm or refute it. Otto Strasser's version, published in his memoirs and collected by several of Hitler's biographers, states that Geli had confided to him, shortly before his death, that he wanted to distance himself from Hitler definitively. That she could no longer bear the obsessive jealousy, the confinement, the demands. If that is true, and Strasser was a political enemy of Hitler with reasons of his own for exaggeration, the September 18th discussion may have been more explosive than the official version acknowledges. What is consistently documented is the effect of Geli's death on Hitler. For days it was unable to function. His aides feared he would commit suicide as well. Geli's room at the Berghof was preserved exactly as she had left it, with her belongings intact, fresh flowers and portraits, until the end of the regime in 1945. Hitler had portraits of Geli hung both in his Munich apartment and in his office in the Chancellery in Berlin. He affirmed on several occasions to people in his inner circle that Geli had been the only woman he had ever loved in his life. For the Munich police in 1931, the case was suicide. For most historians too, though with reservations about the exact circumstances. For some researchers, including Fabiano Massimi and several authors who have reviewed the available archives, the evidence is anomalous enough to keep the question open. The full documentation was never available, never will be, and that makes Geli Raubal's death one of the most personal and darkest mysteries of Hitler's life. Alois Hitler died on January 3, 1903 in Leonding, near Linz, of a heart attack while sipping his morning coffee at a local tavern. Adolf was 13 years old. The news reached the school during the morning. The father was 65 years old and had been a customs inspector in Braunau am Inn, then in Linz and in other destinations throughout his career. He was known in local circles for his strong temper, social ambition and love of dogs and bees. Also because of the emotional distance from their children and, according to several testimonies collected by biographers, because of the physical punishment. In Mein Kampf, Hitler described his father with an odd mix of bureaucratic distance and formal respect. He recounts the discussions about his artistic vocation. His father wanted him to pursue a career as a civil servant like him, without mentioning affection in any direction. He describes how he deliberately failed all subjects except drawing to force his father's hand, and how Alois refused also to give in. The tone is that of a rivalry of wills, not that of an emotional relationship. The word love does not appear in relation to the father. The historian John Toland, in his extensive biography Adolf Hitler, 1976, collected testimonies from neighbors of Hafeld and Leonding who recalled hearing the child Adolf scream during beatings. Psychologist Alice Miller, in For Your Own Good: Roots of Violence in Child Education, 1980, used Hitler's case as a central example of what she called poisonous pedagogy, the pattern of authoritarian and humiliating education that produces in the child, according to her theory, a psychological structure of authoritarianism that is reproduced in adulthood. Miller's argument, although influential in popular psychology, was criticized by historians as simplifying and as tending to reduce complex historical phenomena to individual traumas. What makes this mystery specific is that the testimonies about the relationship between Alois and Adolf Hitler are almost all second-hand, remembered by people who at the time were children or very young, and collected decades after the fact. Hitler himself never spoke publicly about his father with the emotional frankness necessary to understand what happened between them, and the documents of family life in Haarfeld, in Passau, in Lambach and in Leonding are fragmentary. A minor but significant fact: when Alois Hitler died, Adolf did not show the mourning that would be expected. Several testimonies of the time indicate that the mother was the one who broke down in tears, while the eldest son remained unperturbed. Years later, in private conversations collected by secretaries and collaborators, Hitler spoke of his mother with an affection that does not appear in any reference to his father. Alois Hitler's formative influence on the psychology of who would become Adolf Hitler is, paradoxically, the darkest chapter of a biography that has too many dark chapters. Adolf Hitler was born into a practicing Catholic family in Braunau am Inn, a town of the Inn on the Austro-Bavarian border, on April 20th, 1889. He was baptized the next day. As a young man, he was an altar boy at the Benedictine Abbey in Lambach. In Mein Kampf, he used the expression providence with a frequency that his biographers have analyzed in detail. It appears more than 40 times in the text, always as a force that had chosen him, that guided him, that protected him. In his public speeches, the tone was consistently messianic. In the speech of January 30th, 1939, in the Reichstag, he spoke of Nazism as the fulfillment of a historical design that transcended individual men. But privately, according to the after-table conversations dictated by Hitler himself to Martin Bormann between July 1941 and November 1944 over meals at Wolf's Lair headquarters and other locations, the tone was radically different. Hitler called Catholicism the greatest deception of history, and predicted that after the war the Third Reich would end the influence of the Church in Germany. He described Christianity as an instrument of racial weakening, an Eastern imposition on the Germanic spirit. He spoke of the Pope with a contempt that contrasted violently with the public language of diplomatic concordance. What did Hitler believe then, if not the Catholicism he publicly professed? The answer is not simple, and there is probably no single answer. Hitler was a passionate reader of pseudo-scientific racial theories. He knew and assimilated the ideas of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, whose work The Foundations of the 19th Century, 1899, argued for Aryan racial superiority from an impressive pseudo-historical apparatus, and Arthur de Gobineau. These readings, combined with the Viennese cultural environment of the early 20th century, saturated with occultism, esotericism, and theories about lost races, shaped his worldview at an early stage. The link between Nazism and esoteric societies is a partial historical fact. The Thule Society, founded in Munich in 1918 by Rudolf von Sebottendorf, believed in the Arctic origin of the Germanic race and practiced Nordic-inspired rituals. Several of its members founded the German Workers' Party, from which the NSDAP was born. Anton Drexler, Rudolf Hess, and Alfred Rosenberg were members of the Thule. But Hitler was never a member of the Thule Society, and once in power, banned it. In one of his statements, collected by several witnesses, he explicitly said, "I have already banned all this nonsense firmly several times, all these stories of the places of Thing, of the solstices, of the serpent of Midgard." The mistrust was real. The one who was the real passionate about esotericism within the Nazi leadership was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS. Himmler founded the Ahnenerbe in 1935, Inheritance of the Ancestors, an organization with 43 different departments dedicated to the study of Germanic folklore, Aryan prehistory, runes, and occultism. He financed Otto Rahn in his expeditions to the Pyrenees in search of the Holy Grail among the ruins of the Cathars at Montségur. He ordered the scientific expedition to Tibet of biologist Ernst Schäfer between April 1938 and May 1939. who returned with a Kalachakra mandala and a scroll in which the Tibetan Regency Council recognized Hitler as chief of the Aryans. He requisitioned Wewelsburg Castle in Buren, Westphalia, to make it the ceremonial center of the SS, with a meeting room where 12 SS gentlemen sat around a round oak table. Hitler tolerated all that. He used it when it was politically convenient, but he did not share it. His worldview was a mixture of social Darwinism applied to races, political voluntarism taken to its logical extremes, and a belief in himself, in his own historical genius, in his own mission, that transcended any external belief system. That was his religion, himself. And the only question that psychology has not resolved is whether that belief was sincere or instrumental.